Hey, everybody. Welcome to Better Love and Sex. I am your host, Devi Ward, and I want to thank you for tuning in and joining me this evening for another enlightening conversation where we explore ways for all of us to awaken, heal, and transform our sexuality so that we can have more love, better sex, and ultimately live lives that are truly fulfilling and truly nourishing. Our guest this evening is Miss Beverly Engel, and she is an internationally recognized psychotherapist and the author of 20 self-help books, including the bestsellers The Emotionally Abusive Relationship, Loving Him Without Losing You, and Healing Your Emotional Self. Those sound like wonderful, wonderful books. Engel is a licensed marriage and family therapist who has been practicing psychotherapy for 30 years. She has appeared on Oprah, CNN, and Starting Over, as well as other national television shows in the United States and Canada. She has regularly contributed to O Magazine, Psychology Today, and has been featured in a number of newspapers and magazines, including the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and Shape. And it is an absolute honor to have you here this evening, Beverly.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, you're very, very welcome. So you are an authority on childhood sexual abuse. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So just so our audience knows what we're dealing with, could you define what childhood sexual abuse is, what exactly it would look like, what are the behaviors that would constitute having experienced sexual abuse?
Okay, well, in general, childhood sexual abuse is any contact between an adult and a child or an older child and a younger child for the purposes of sexual stimulation of either the child or the adult, and usually results in sexual gratification for the older person. Now, that doesn't mean that there has to be actual penetration. That can include anything from fondling, having the child fondle the adult fondling the child. It can even include genital exposure, the adult or older child exposing his or her genitals to the child. It can include masturbating in front of the child or having the child masturbate the adult or the adult masturbating the child. It can include oral sex, either giving or receiving. It can include penetration either of the vagina or the anus. And that could be penetration, digital penetration with a finger. It can also include dry intercourse, which would be like lying on top of the child and rubbing. And it can include showing the child pornography for the purposes of stimulating the child or the adult.
Mm-hmm. So it can look a variety of different ways, but
Absolutely.
The main issue is that it's sexual contact for the purpose of stimulating the adult and possibly the child, but it sounds like most of the older person involved is primarily stimulating them in some way. Because I'm assuming
Right.
if they're watching the child being stimulated, they're going to be stimulated as well.
Right.
So I have a question before we get in to the other questions, though, because something that you said about a child and an older child brought up something for me, and I'm curious. So where is the line drawn between sexual abuse and children just kind of discovering each other or discovering themselves? Because I think I remember as a child, I had some friends and we showed each other our private parts and that sort of thing, and that was part of our childhood self-discovery. So where is the line drawn between that and actual abuse?
It's usually agreed that if the child is as much as 2 years older, if the older child is 2 years older than the younger child, that there's an inequality there. There's an imbalance of power. And generally speaking, that's considered sexual abuse because it's not just two kids of the same age exploring. It usually involves an older child who is actually sexually more sophisticated and often, unfortunately, has already been sexually molested himself, who's now repeating the cycle of abuse by going for a younger child. We know that childhood sexual abuse, like rape, is more an act of violence and power, having power over a younger person or a weaker person, than it really is even about sexuality. So unfortunately, when you get a child who's even 2 years older, that's often the purpose is to have power over the younger child.
To dominate them in some way.
Have dominance, yeah.
So in regards to childhood sexual abuse, it's from the statistics that I've read, it's very, very prevalent. It said that 1 in 3 to 4 women and 1 in 5 boys has experienced some form of sexual abuse as a child. Is that congruent with what you're aware of?
Yes, and as everybody always says, we know it's probably more because of the underreporting.
So the reality is that for many people, they probably are in relationship with somebody who has experienced sexual abuse, or at least at some point in their life, they have been in relationship with someone who's experienced sexual abuse because it's so widespread and so prevalent.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what are some of the special problems that partners of survivors of childhood sexual abuse would face?
Well, if the partner has told you about their childhood sexual abuse experience, you kind of go into the relationship kind of prepared for possibly some difficulties. But unfortunately, what happens is that the person who was sexually abused often hides it from their partner. And that's more prevalent with men who've been sexually abused, not telling their female partner. As we know, there's a great deal of shame around sexual abuse, but there's even more shame around a male admitting that he was sexually abused. He feels more responsible for the abuse. He feels like he should have stopped it. He feels like maybe he did something to attract the abuser. So, and males in general in our society don't ever want to acknowledge they've been victimized in any way. And so there's a great deal of shame. So unfortunately, a lot of women get involved with men who were sexually abused in childhood, and they don't know it ahead of time. And only after they start experiencing problems in the relationship do they find out. Now, the same thing holds true for men. There's a lot of men out there who don't know that their partner was sexually abused. It's just more prevalent with women. With men not telling. So the special problems that come up are obviously going to be around intimacy issues, trust issues, and sexual dysfunction. Those are the 3 primary problems that come up for somebody who was sexually abused when they're in a relationship with someone.
So sexual dysfunction, what would that look like?
It can run the gamut of everything from in a male with having premature ejaculation or impotency issues or difficulty having orgasms, females, painful intercourse, difficulty having orgasms. It can also involve not being able or not being willing to be touched on certain parts of their bodies. For example, if whatever form of sexual abuse occurred, for example, let's say there was fondling of a young girl, and what was fondled were her breasts. The molester didn't fondle her vagina. So she may be fine having her partner touch her vagina. She's fine having intercourse because the perpetrator didn't have intercourse with her. But whatever the perpetrator did to her, that would be an area where she would have some difficulty possibly. So she might not want to have her breast touched. She might not want to have her partner talk about her breasts or compliment her on her breasts. A male, if the person who molested him, touched his testicles, he might not want to have his partner touch his testicles. So we find people who have areas of their body that they don't want to have touched, or certain types of touching they won't like, or certain sexual acts they won't like. And it's usually because that's what was done to them as a child.
Mm-hmm. So it's triggering for them at this point.
Right. So we also have lack of sexual desire, or the extreme of the opposite, which would be a hypersexuality, having a partner who kind of insists on having sex all the time. It's very often one of the two extremes.
I had read an article many, many years ago about how there was I don't know what the word is, predominance or an uprising of women in their mid-30s who were suddenly remembering having been sexually abused as a child. The memories were suppressed for most of their lives, and then they just all of a sudden started remembering, and one of the symptoms was they went from having a very normal and natural, healthy sexual desire to having absolutely no sexual desire whatsoever, and that was before they even realized, but that was like a pre-symptom of the abuse memories arising.
Right. That kind of thing is fairly common. Another thing that's common is your sexuality may be fine until you have a child, and that when that child reaches a certain age, the age when you were molested, suddenly the memories may come back. You may have repressed all the memories until you actually had a child, and then your sexuality can be affected. And, of course, fears about your child being abused can come up. But memories can be triggered by all kinds of things. A lot of people don't have memories until something triggers the memories.
So that is a fairly common experience that people just kind of suppress it or don't remember, and then all of a sudden later on in life they're like, whoa, I was sexually abused as a child. Right. So what are some red flags to look out for? Because, and that was the case with me. I actually went through all of my life not realizing that I had been sexually molested as a child, and then, 4 years ago, I started having the memories surface, and it was a relief. It was a shock, but it was also a relief because it made so much about me and my life make sense, finally. It was like the missing piece of the puzzle. And looking back over my life, I could see all the little red flags that, because I didn't understand what was going on, at the time I didn't recognize as red flags. So if you're in a relationship with somebody and you may suspect that they've been sexually abused, or you don't know, or, you may be totally clueless, but you're listening to this program, what are some red flags to look out for in your partner's behavior that may indicate that they may have experienced this type of abuse as a child?
Well, all the things I've talked about so far, the sexual problems that can come up, of course, there's lots of other causes for sexual dysfunction. But I would look especially for somebody who has a lack of sexual desire, somebody that you have to always be kind of talking them into having sex. They would just really prefer not to have sex. Or the opposite, somebody who's just hypersexual, who has to have sex all the time, who's constantly complaining to you that you're not sexual enough. Somebody who has compulsive masturbation, just masturbating constantly, and there's always a pressure for sex. Those two extremes. And then, like I said, not wanting to have certain parts of the body touched, not wanting to get involved in certain kinds of sexual activities. Now, there's a lot of people who might not want to get involved, say, with kinky sex. That doesn't mean that they were sexually abused. But if you have a particular position that you like and your partner just refuses to even try it, that could be an indication. Okay? So I would really ask more questions and talk about it. As far as general red flags, it's just so difficult to say. There's so many. If somebody has to be drunk before they have sex, or has to be, high on some kind of a drug before they can have sex. If your partner seems to really change radically, she or he seems kind of conservative, and then when they start to drink, they really kind of another personality kind of pops out, and they become, really intense around sexuality and kind of pressuring you and maybe wanting to watch pornography, something that's kind of out of character for them. Somebody, you saw them as one way, and then when they drink, they become somebody else. That would be certainly be a red flag.
So a shift in the personality when drinking alcohol and,
yes.
and becoming aggressive, sexually aggressive.
Right.
So if you're in a relationship with someone and these things that you described are ringing bells and you suspect that your partner may have been sexually abused, or your partner has actually expressed they have been sexually abused, how can you or I as a partner be supportive of that person's problem?
Well, the most important thing probably would be for you to become as educated as you can about childhood sexual abuse and its effects. and also to not take things personally. The more you the more you know, the more you learn, the less you will take things personally. But, for example, if your partner kind of lacks sexual desire and you learn that your partner was sexually abused, then hopefully you won't take it personally when he or she, turns you down. Hopefully you'll begin to understand that this is a difficult issue for your partner, and you want to look for ways to make your partner feel more comfortable and relaxed versus getting upset and feeling rejected.
Mm-hmm. So learning about what the symptoms are, learning the signs can be very helpful to understanding what's going on for the survivor and how to best support them, because taking things personally obviously isn't going to support them in their healing process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really necessary that they get information, because there's a lot to learn, and the more they learn, they won't take it as personally, and they will be more supportive.
So can you recommend, I know that you have a book that I read, I can't remember the title of it, it's fabulous. So could you share with our audience your titles that you have and any other titles you have to recommend for people who want to learn more about what these symptoms are?
Well, my book is recommended because it's called The Right to Innocence. It's just a small paperback. It's been out for years, but it's one of the best books around because it's written in very easily understandable terms, and it's not overwhelming. It doesn't have a lot of horrible case histories that kind of traumatize people. The Courage to Heal, of course, is a wonderful book, and they've written a couple of books, one for partners. And they're wonderful books. The problem with them that I've heard from some clients is the case stories can be a little bit overwhelming, a little bit traumatic for some people. So my book is a good one to start with. There's a book actually called The Sexual Healing Journey, and that's a very good book for people who are having some sexual issues because of sexual abuse. It's good for the partner and for the victim.
And so all of these, can these just be found on Amazon?
Yes.
So Beverly, is it true that people who were sexually abused in childhood are often drawn to each other?
Absolutely. I don't know that anybody's ever been able to explain that exactly, except that it's common in lots of different issues. For lots of different issues, for example, alcoholics are often drawn to each other, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's, Freud's concept of the, repetition compulsion, that we're trying to resolve our issues with our parents, so we, keep repeating the same patterns. I don't know why it is that we can find each other, but we do. People who were sexually abused very often end up with a partner who was sexually abused. Now, sometimes if they're in a 12-step program or something, or in a sexual abuse anonymous group or something, they've shared that. And so, that may be part of it, but that's usually not the case. They usually just kind of meet randomly, and they find out, that each of them were abused. And again, because of you mentioned the statistics, I guess there's also part of the explanation is that, there's so many people who were sexually abused that it would make sense that we'd find each other. But it's very, very common.
Yeah, it's like the law of attraction, right? Magnetizing each other.
Right.
So you had mentioned wanting to share some techniques around being triggered. Would you like to talk more about that?
Sure. One thing that can happen is that when a couple, I'm going to make it a man and a woman, but I want everybody to understand, we could be talking about gay couples too. Gay couples and lesbian couples have the same difficulties. In fact, there's a high rate of sexual abuse in the gay and lesbian community. So, I'll try to remember to bring that up, when I say that. But, please excuse me if I refer to men and women, mostly. Let's say a couple is having sex, a man and a woman, 2 men, 2 women, and one of them gets triggered by something, some memory, some touch. Music can be a trigger. A smell can be a trigger. I was sexually abused as a child, and Vaseline used to be a trigger for me. And at that time, before lubricants became so popular, a lot of men used Vaseline. And I didn't know it, but it was a trigger for me. The jar was a trigger. Seeing a jar of Vaseline on a night table could be a trigger for me. So when the partner is triggered during intercourse or during sexual experience, what can happen is it takes the person back. It takes the partner who was abused back in time, and they're suddenly feeling as if they're with their perpetrator. And that can just freak them out, of course, cause them to have all kinds of emotional reactions. It can also cause them to just kind of freeze, dissociate, become numb. And what the partner needs to learn is that kind of what the cues are to figure out when their partner has been triggered. If she suddenly goes stiff and she's no longer moving and she doesn't even feel like she's there, that's probably a good sign, okay? If she starts crying, that could be an indication. But the partner needs to become aware of what the signs are of their partner being triggered, and then the partner needs to stop all movement, stop all activity, and look in the eyes of their partner and have their partner look in their eyes, so that the person who was abused is now looking in the face of their partner and seeing in those moments that they're not with their perpetrator, they're with their partner, and they need to make that connection with each other and wait until the person who was abused, until they come back to the present before they start any kind of movement again. And if they do that, if the partner number one really gets in touch with what the symptoms are when their partner is triggered, or obviously it's even more important that the partner who's been molested says something if they can. If they can have a code word or if they can say stop, that's great. But unfortunately, they can't always speak in those moments. So that's where the partner comes in, who has to kind of be aware of the sign. And that's it's extremely effective way of having the activities go on again and continue even after somebody's triggered. They have to be brought back to the present. They need to breathe. They need to look in their partner's face and see their partner's face. I've had some clients who even continue to see their perpetrator's face for a few minutes, and they have to wait until they actually see their partner's face before they ever continue. And for some people, they can't continue, okay? That's it for the night, or that's it for the day once they've been triggered. But it's a very effective technique for being able to get back into it again.
So I have a question for you. Say somebody is able to go through that cycle, and their partner notices that they've frozen, and they talk them through it, and they get present again, and they're able to get through that and then begin making love again. Does that heal? Is that part of the healing process of the trauma?
I don't know if I can even answer that for sure. In a sense, it's healing. It's healing for the relationship because it's building trust. The person who was sexually abused is building trust in their partner that he or she's that in touch with them and is willing to stop, is willing to put aside their own sexual desires for the moment. So it can certainly build trust. And you would think that positive experiences like that would help in the healing process. But honestly, I don't know. I don't know if it actually heals the abuse or it's just going to be more healing to the relationship.
And you've been working with supporting people in this for 30 years. Is that correct?
Right.
So here's a question for you. In your 30 years, how common is it for women who have experienced sexual abuse to experience vaginal pain?
I'm sorry, to experience vaginal orgasm, were you saying?
No, vaginal pain. So
vaginal pain.
It's
quite common. It's quite common. It's a very significant symptom of sexual abuse. Of course, other things can cause vaginal pain, but it's a very common symptom. There's other things that can cause vaginal pain, such as not being lubricated enough, having a smaller vaginal cavity and the man having a very large penis. Things like that can cause some pain. But those things usually can be fixed, with more lubrication or whatever. Vaginal pain that's caused from sexual abuse is more long-standing. It doesn't seem to be a factor. The size of the penis or the lubrication doesn't seem to be that much of a factor. It's more of an emotional pain that comes up.
And what about for men? What are genital symptoms that they experience? Premature ejaculation sounds like one, perhaps inability to orgasm. What have you observed through the years?
Actually, one of the most common symptoms for a male is not being able to ejaculate, not being able to have an orgasm. It used to be called retarded ejaculation. It's called something else now. I forgot what it was. But it's partly an issue of trust, letting go. They may kind of be holding themselves in check emotionally and not completely trusting their partner. And this wouldn't be necessarily conscious on their part, but or sexuality could be traumatizing in itself without them realizing it. As it's kind of as you think of it, a man having an orgasm and ejaculation is really kind of a letting go. It's a letting go of control. It's really being vulnerable. And so we could see that a male who was sexually abused may have some difficulties letting go like that.
So how can partners learn to cope with these problems? What can they do?
Well, again, the most important thing is reading about it, learning about it, and then secondly, the second most important thing, obviously, is to talk with each other, have an open discussion about, what do you need from me? What are your fears? What are your concerns? Really openly talking with each other. That's the best thing in the world. If the partner who is sexually abused can be completely open and share everything, share their concerns, their trust issues, their fears, then they're going to be able to build trust together, just like in any relationship.
And how important do you think it is for the person who was sexually abused to get some outside support, some counseling or psychotherapy, or just some guidance in how to work deal? Yeah.
Well, I think it's really, really important. It's vitally important, and if they have some issue with one-on-one individual counseling, if it's either because they can't afford it or they just can't get themselves to go and talk to somebody about it, I really highly recommend groups. Groups for survivors of childhood sexual abuse are very, very successful. In fact, groups for survivors can be as effective, if not more so, than even individual counseling. The support of being in a room with other people who have the same problems is just wonderful. Especially for male survivors, to be in a room and hear other people's stories and find out they're not alone, and find out that other people have had the same issues, and then they hear how the other people have solved the issues. It's just fabulous how much change can come from that.
So getting support, whether it's one-on-one counseling or finding a group in their area. So how would somebody find a group? Can they just Google, groups for survivors of childhood sexual abuse?
They can start with that. They can also check through the AA programs, through the 12-step programs, see if there's a 12-step program. Unfortunately, you've got to be really careful. There are groups for survivors, but there are also a lot of sexual addiction groups. And survivors of sexual abuse who were not sexually addicted, very often, don't have a very good experience in a 12-step program where there are sex addicts, because sex addicts can also be molesters. Mm-hmm. And you don't want victims and molesters in the same room together. So, but 12-step programs can actually refer you to other programs. You can go through any kind of nonprofit organization like a a rape crisis helpline, a rape crisis center in your area. They serve men as well as women, and they often have support groups. So that's actually probably the better way to go. And then if you can't find anything, you could try through the 12-step program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because being a survivor isn't the same as being an addict, or is it?
Well, it's not the same at all, except that a lot of survivors are also sex addicts. So,
okay.
but they're two separate issues to be worked on separately, actually. Again, you wouldn't want a group of people who are talking about their sexual addiction, even though they probably were sexually abused too. But their sexual addiction is the primary thing for them to be working on. And a survivor needs to be working on a whole other issues and not be in the same room as somebody who may be a perpetrator also.
So it sounds as though, sexual abuse leads to the survivor then becoming a perpetrator in many cases. So it's just kind of a vicious cycle that occurs. How common is that?
Well, it's a very touchy subject. It's very common, unfortunately, but there's a lot of factors involved. One is it's more common with males who are sexually abused to become a perpetrator. We do have females who were sexually abused to become perpetrators, but it's just not as many at all. It's a big difference, actually, in the numbers. And not all males who are sexually abused are perpetrators. That's for sure. There are a lot of males who are sexually abused who are not perpetrators and, in fact, go out of their way to protect children and to take on a role as somebody who protects children. So we don't want to stigmatize males who are sexually abused to say that they are going to be perpetrators, because that's not the case. But then we look at people who are sexual perpetrators, and they mostly were sexually abused, okay, or physically abused in childhood. So it's confusing because it goes one way, but it doesn't go the other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it makes sense. I understand that not all survivors, male survivors or female survivors, become perpetrators, but it sounds as though many perpetrators do have a history.
Right.
Yeah. So what about the issue of pornography? How does that play into the whole dynamic?
Well, it's extremely difficult nowadays because so many people are into pornography. It's so common. And unfortunately, pornography for a survivor of sexual abuse can be a huge trigger because so many perpetrators use pornography to introduce sex to the children. The man who molested me, it was way before pornography is the way it was today, but he showed me magazines. I remember him showing me magazines and telling me that this is what people do who love each other. So he used pornography to introduce me to sexual abuse. And child molesters very often, again, with males, it's very common for, let's say the scenario is a neighborhood guy. He's a real guy and real pal. He's real friendly with all the guys in the neighborhood. He invites them all over to watch video games. And then he shows them pornography. And, young teenage guy loves to see pornography and keeps going over there, and he keeps getting friendly with them and, gives them Cokes and chips. And pretty soon he comes on to him. And that's a very common scenario. So pornography can be a trigger for anybody who was sexually abused and where pornography was involved. And there's also the horror stories of children who were used to film pornographic films, who were used to film child porn. And the numbers of people who have that experience are much higher than you would ever imagine. And so pornography, a couple, they've been together for a while and everything's great, but, they kind of want to spice up their lovemaking, and, one of them suggests, renting a pornographic film or, getting a pornographic video or whatever, and they start to watch, and the person who was sexually abused gets horribly triggered, has memories come up perhaps for the first time, or comes up, the memories come up and they're a great deal of pain and they're dissociated, they're numb. Or the other thing can happen, that they become aroused and they then want to have pornography all the time in order to have a real high. But that is not healthy for somebody who was molested and pornography was involved. They're not really with their partner anymore. They're reliving the sexual abuse, and it's not healthy for them at all. So it can be a huge problem.
That sounds like it. So what about when a survivor gets to the point of having children? Does a history of childhood sexual abuse have an effect on their decision to have children or how they raise their children?
Absolutely. Again, let's talk about somebody who has their memory. That person may be overprotective. They may have a fear of having children because they're so afraid that their children are going to be abused, that may be actually something that gets in their way of having children. Or when they have children, they be so overly protective that it actually becomes a problem. And the couple may be fighting over it. The child may just be feeling smothered. So that can be a huge problem because the person who is sexually abused may be assuming that things are going on that aren't going on, and they don't want their kids going over to spend the night at their friend's house. I mean, they can just really be almost paranoid, and we can understand why. That wasn't a criticism. So it can be a huge problem. And unfortunately, people who are sexually abused sometimes don't even trust their partners, and that's really, really sad. We could have had a couple who were having a really good relationship, even a very healing relationship for the person who was sexually abused, and a child comes into the family, and suddenly the partner is suspect. Suddenly I have clients who can't have their partner change the diaper of the baby. I have clients who can't let their partner be in a room alone with the child. They're so afraid that the partner is going to become sexually abusive. And that brings us full circle to going back to this idea about not taking things personally. Now, I understand that's easier said than done, to not take it personally if your partner is so afraid that you're going to molest your child that you can't be alone with your child. How can you not take that personally? But if you really know that it's a symptom and you really can be understanding, the two of you can work it out, probably by having some therapy together, or at the very least having the partner who was molested have some therapy to get past this fear. But that's a real good example. If the partner knows what's going on, he or she won't take it so personally. But it can be a huge problem of having children and being afraid of what could happen. The opposite can also happen. We have mothers who suddenly become deaf, dumb, and blind with their daughters, with a stepfather or a man that they bring into the house making overt gestures toward their daughter, and suddenly the mother doesn't see it. She doesn't see anything going on whatsoever, and that's another symptom of childhood sexual abuse is kind of zoning out and not seeing what's right in front of your face. If she were to face the fact that this new man was coming onto her daughter, number one, she'd have to get rid of the man, but number two, she might have to face her own memories of her own childhood sexual abuse. So if she's repressed her memories and suddenly this is going on in front of her face, she might not even see it.
Yeah, so it's kind of a state of denial.
Right.
Yeah. So it sounds as though from everything you've said this evening that one of the primary issues is knowing that you've been sexually abused, and then if you know that you have, then communicating that to your partner so that you're both on the same page. You're both reading out of the same book. Because if not, it's kind of, it sounds kind of hopeless if you're just
Yeah.
floundering and, blundering around in the dark, and all these triggers and all these traumas are arising, and nobody understands why. Nobody understands.
Right.
Nobody's able to read the signs and symptoms. So
exactly. Unfortunately, I've had lots of couples who got divorced and didn't come into therapy till after the divorce, and didn't talk to their partner about their childhood sexual abuse, and it could have probably saved the marriage. So it's kind of almost irresponsible if you know you were abused. Well, it is irresponsible to not tell your partner, but it's also irresponsible to not get help and not, consciously communicate with your partner about the issue.
Yeah, and the reality is, I know for myself, I didn't understand that much of my behavior was actually like textbook case of someone who has been sexually abused. So until I became more educated myself, I didn't know. I didn't know to communicate, oh, this is a symptom of my sexual abuse, so don't take it personally, because I didn't know, right?
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So us as survivors becoming educated about ourselves and about what very, very common signs and indications are, and some of the natural repercussions, very natural repercussions of experiencing that sort of trauma.
Absolutely. And really getting it that you can't help it. You need to have, if you're a survivor, you need to have a lot of compassion for yourself. And that's different than self-pity or not getting over it. There's so much in our culture now is this whole idea, just move on, get over it. Victim has become a bad word. And, people are just thinking that they just have to get past everything. Well, you don't get past sexual abuse without some help, without some counseling, without some education, without support. You can't just decide I'm going to get past it.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point to make, and I love that you said that, because, there is so much, just get over it, why are you crying in your soup sort of thing, and it's a trauma, and trauma gets imprinted in our bodies and in our nervous system, and it's important to get support in order to fully heal it. And, and healing may be a lifelong journey. It doesn't mean it has to be, traumatizing and catastrophic, but it can be a lifelong journey of undoing some of what has been done to us, especially when we were very, very young.
Absolutely.
Well, Beverly, it's been an honor to have you, and we are just about out of time. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you feel is important to share with our audience? We have about 3 minutes.
Well, just that a lot of people have a problem with therapy. So, therapy is not the only answer. And, of course, I'm a therapist, so I would say it's the best answer. But groups are important. Groups are really effective. And there's other kinds of modalities. There are body therapies that are really excellent for people who are sexually abused children. There's all kinds of ways of, like you just mentioned, the trauma in the body. Fortunately, today we have lots of different choices as to how we can get healing.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, if you know or you suspect, then start venturing out and start reading books, the books that you suggested, start perhaps looking for groups, start looking perhaps for a counselor, but get the support that you need to heal.
Absolutely.
So if our audience would like to get a hold of you, where can they find you?
I have a website, www.beverlyengel.com, and they can connect through there, or they can email me directly at beverly@beverlyengel.com, and that's ENGEL. So beverly@beverlyengel.com.
All right, so beverlyengel.com. Well, it has been an absolute honor and pleasure and joy to have you here this evening and share this very important information with our audience.
Thanks for having me, Devi. You asked really great questions.
That's what people say. That's good to hear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Wonderful, and thank you all for listening. I hope this evening has been enlightening for you and supportive for you, and given you the tools that you need, or at least suggested the tools that you need to support you in your healing journey. Thank you all for tuning in, and join in next week for another exciting adventure of Better Love and Sex with Devi Ward.